You know, the kind of silence that follows a slap you didn't hear coming? That was the room, dead silent, after my Aunt Janice turned to me during the quarterly board meeting and said with a smirk, "Still just a mediocre secretary, huh?" I was seated at the far end of the polished mahogany table, jotting down minutes like I always did. The room was filled with executives in tailored suits, department heads, investors, and of course, Janice, my late father's sister and the woman who had taken over the company's leadership after his death. She was polished, loud, and loved being the smartest in any room. I blinked, unsure if I heard her right. She didn't wait for a response. Her red, lacquered nails danced in the air as she chuckled and turned back to the VP of Finance. "She's been here, 7 years? 8? Still fetching coffee and scribbling notes. I mean, ambition just isn't for everyone." A few people forced awkward smiles. Most looked away. And me? I sat perfectly still. My pen hadn't moved in 10 seconds. I could feel my face flush, but I forced myself to breathe. Deeply. Slowly. Not a single person defended me. Not even Charles, the COO who had personally emailed me at midnight last week begging for last-minute projections. No one said, "Hey, that's not fair." No one said, "Actually, Myra's been essential on multiple projects." They just let it happen, because in their eyes, I was just the quiet one. The secretary, the polite girl in beige who took notes, scheduled meetings, and blended into the wallpaper. But what they didn't know, what Janice had conveniently ignored, was that I had been in almost every room where decisions were made. I had built bridges with clients, smoothed over crises before they blew up, and memorized more about this company than half the people sitting at that table. Still, I said nothing. I turned the page in my notebook calmly and wrote, "Q2 revenue projections under review." Janice went on talking, flaunting numbers, using big words, laughing a little too loud. But every word after that insult felt like static to me. I wasn't hurt. I was reminded of how long she'd underestimated me, how little she knew about the moves happening behind the curtain, and how satisfying it would be when she realized the signature they'd need tomorrow to finalize their $373 million deal would have to come from me. But not today. Today, I just sat, smiled faintly, and nodded when they asked if I could book the follow-up call. Because sometimes the most powerful answer is silence. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the pen that can change everything. They saw me as a shadow, a soft voice, a secretary, but no one ever asked how I got there. If they had, they would have learned I wasn't always Mira the note-taker in a pencil skirt. I used to be Mira the loud one, Mira the troublemaker, Mira the girl who wasn't invited to family dinners because she made them uncomfortable. When my dad passed, I was just 18. 1 week out of high school. Everyone expected me to fall in line, to either marry someone safe or vanish into a quiet, forgettable job. My Aunt Janice stepped into the spotlight almost instantly. She handled the funeral arrangements, stood tall in front of the company shareholders, and in one elegant motion, absorbed my father's legacy like she'd been preparing for it her whole life. She never looked back at me, not once. I had no seat at that table. While Janice was out hosting luncheons and accepting awards in our family's name, I was scrubbing floors at a late-night diner and folding napkins for minimum wage. I enrolled in night school, community college, then university, working 2 jobs to pay for courses no one believed I could pass. I'd do double shifts, come home sore and exhausted, and still spend hours studying spreadsheets, marketing strategies, and contracts long after midnight. I didn't party. I didn't post about grinding. I just worked. Quietly, steadily, and I watched. I watched how Janice operated, how she sweet-talked clients, how she maneuvered around investors, how she always stayed polished but never personal. She was brilliant, no doubt, but heartless. Even when I finally joined the company, she never introduced me as family. Just Mira, one of our assistants. Like I'd wandered in from the hallway and never left. I started in the mailroom, then admin, then scheduling. Every time I moved up, she'd raise a perfectly arched brow and say, "Well, if that's what she wants." She thought ambition was something loud, flashy, ruthless. She didn't understand my kind. I learned the company's heartbeat by being its quiet pulse. While Janice was schmoozing big clients, I was sitting in strategy meetings with people who actually did the work. I offered ideas, never loudly, never pushing. Just enough. I built trust. Slowly. Authentically. And when the CEO, Mr. Griffin, was preparing to retire, guess who he pulled aside one rainy evening in the hallway? Me. I've seen what you've done here, Mira. And more importantly, I've seen how you treat people, he said. The company needs someone who understands both the spreadsheets and the souls behind them. He mentored me for a year. Quietly. No announcements. No one knew I had been shadowing him, attending private briefings, meeting stakeholders behind the scenes. And when he stepped down, the board already had the paperwork ready. Approved. Signed. I had already been promoted. But I didn't take the CEO title publicly. Not yet. Because I wanted to see. I wanted to know exactly how the people who claimed to care about me would treat me if they thought I was still just the secretary. And Janice? She didn't disappoint. She mocked me like always, thinking I was harmless, invisible, safe to belittle. But the truth is, I had grown into something she never expected. And soon, she'd come face to face with the woman she helped create, without even realizing it. Titles are just words, until they become shields. When I chose to keep executive coordinator under my nameplate, people assumed I was stuck. Maybe I didn't want more. Maybe I wasn't capable of more. That's how they talked when I wasn't in the room, or worse, when I was just sitting silently beside a spreadsheet, jotting notes while they made billion-dollar decisions. But here's the thing. The entire time they were looking down at me, I was managing the actual numbers. After my father died, the will revealed something no one expected. While Aunt Janice took the public spotlight and handled the PR chaos, I inherited 30% of the company shares, locked in a trust until I turned 25. No one, not even Janice, paid attention to the fine print. She was too busy reshuffling the executive staff and soaking in sympathy calls from the board. She thought she'd clean the slate. But I waited, quietly. By the time I turned 25, I already knew the ins and outs of every department. How operations were stalled by bad leadership, how client accounts were being mishandled by Janice's cronies, how morale had dipped because the workforce felt like pawns instead of partners. I didn't throw tantrums. I didn't demand meetings. I became indispensable. I started handling quiet mergers. I fixed budgets that senior managers couldn't untangle. Clients began asking for me by name, not because I had the title, but because I got results. I wrote strategies that saved millions. I mentored interns, boosted departments, streamlined supply chains. And when my voting rights activated with my shares, I didn't use them recklessly. I built alliances. Some saw it early. One board member even pulled me aside once and asked, "Why don't you take more credit?" I smiled and said, "Not yet." Because strategy isn't just about what you show. It's about when you show it. My aunt had spent years building her reputation on power and polish. But I built something she never thought to value, trust. Authentic, earned trust. From the warehouse managers to the finance analysts, people knew I had their backs. Not just because of bloodlines or legacy, but because I showed up when others didn't. So yes, I still let them call me Mira from Coordination. I let Janice toss me her coffee cup once before a meeting. I let her talk down to me in front of the interns. I let her smirk when I walked in with paper folders instead of a presentation clicker. Because every single second of dismissal was currency. And the payout was coming. They thought they knew who sat at the table. They had no idea who owned it. The buzz in the office was electric. You could feel the tension thrumming through the floors like an unspoken countdown. Phones ringing. PowerPoint slides being tweaked until the last second. Executives skipping lunch. For weeks, every department had been working overtime for one reason. A $373 million international partnership deal with a European conglomerate that would supposedly redefine our company's future. My Aunt Janice strutted through the corridors like she already had the contract framed above her fireplace. Everyone kept saying, "This is her masterpiece." I sat silently in those meetings, 2 chairs down from her, nodding as her voice filled the conference room. She was polished, practiced, loud, but not accurate. She didn't notice how I made tiny notes in the margins of the draft contracts, how I followed up with our compliance team about a clause she missed. She didn't notice that one of the foreign stakeholders had quietly emailed me, not her, asking for clarification on a sensitive clause around data protection. I gave them what they needed. And I waited, because I knew something Janice didn't. While she assumed the deal was hers to seal, she hadn't paid attention to the restructured governance policy my father had left behind. The one that outlined that for any international contract exceeding $250 million, the final signatory must be the acting CEO and at least one major shareholder. And Janice, despite all her loud authority, held neither role. Guess who did? Every legal paper she'd paraded around the board had a blank line at the bottom, waiting for the one signature that made it valid, mine. Of course, I said nothing. I let them book the press conference. I watched the international team fly in. I even brought coffee to the strategy session Janice held the night before, listening as she joked about me being reliable, but still a little green for the big stuff. Everyone laughed. I smiled, because this wasn't just about a deal. It was a test of their perception, their arrogance, and their blindness to what stood right in front of them. The morning of the final signing, Janice walked into the boardroom wearing a power red blazer and a grin that could cut steel. The table was set. The contract was printed. Cameras were being tested for the post-signing media reel. All eyes were on her, until the European rep, a quiet man with glasses and a razor-sharp sense of legalities, looked at the last page and said, "We're still missing the final authorization signature. Where is your CEO?" Janice blinked, laughed politely. "You're looking at her." But he didn't laugh. He looked at me. "Mira Levine," he asked, "isn't your name listed as acting CEO in this registry?" The silence that fell was ice cold. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set it down and stood. "Yes," I said clearly. "That's correct. I'll need a moment to review the final version before I sign." Janice's face drained of color. The board members started whispering. And just like that, her illusion cracked. No shouting, no scenes, just a signature-shaped truth no one could deny. And I wasn't done yet. The next morning, the office looked nothing like the high-gloss powerhouse it pretended to be. The atmosphere was thick with panic. Phones buzzed nonstop. Voices that were usually confident now whispered behind closed doors. The big signing event had turned into a crisis. Word had gotten out. The deal, worth nearly $400 million, was frozen. Investors were calling for answers. And the foreign partners? They were growing suspicious, threatening to walk if paperwork wasn't finalized within 48 hours. At the center of it all was one missing thing, a signature. Mine. Janice had been in damage control mode since sunrise. She rushed from legal to finance to the boardroom and back, flanked by assistants who looked like they were about to collapse. Her voice, usually full of swagger, now cracked with strain as she tried to clarify things with stakeholders. But no amount of smoothing over could change the facts. The legal team finally laid it out in black and white. The deal cannot move forward without Mira Levine's approval. She holds both the acting CEO title and the required shareholder percentage for executive authorization. That sentence was replayed again and again throughout the building. People who had ignored me the day before were now peeking into my office, suddenly remembering my name. I sipped my tea in peace, reading through the final documents on my desk. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't hiding. I was simply letting them feel the weight of what they'd overlooked. At precisely 11 a.m., I walked toward the executive boardroom, and when I opened the door, the reaction was immediate. All heads turned. Some stood. Janice froze mid-sentence, her face visibly tightening. The air shifted, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. For a brief second, no one said a word. Then one of the board members, a man who'd once said in a meeting that I was a sweet girl but not really leadership material, cleared his throat. "Mira, thank you for joining us. We're glad you're here." I nodded but said nothing. Janice tried to regain control, her voice brittle. "We've had a little confusion, but we've sorted most of it out. If you could just sign here." I raised a hand. "I'll sign after I've reviewed every page of the updated draft. Thoroughly." The lawyer to my left gave a subtle nod, confirming that I had every right to request time. After all, I wasn't just an accessory to the process anymore, I was the process. Janice looked like she wanted to protest, but she didn't dare. Instead, she watched in silence as I sat at the head of the table, the seat she usually claimed. I flipped through the documents, slowly, carefully. I highlighted clauses, crossed out inconsistencies, and asked the legal counsel to make final edits before I would agree to put ink on paper. And when I finally signed, I didn't say a word. I simply slid the folder forward and stood. It was the quietest moment of power I'd ever experienced, and it shook the room to its core. Janice didn't look at me as I walked out, but I felt every eye behind me, and I knew for the first time they all saw me for who I truly was. Not a secretary, not the quiet girl in the corner, but the one with the pen, the one with the power. The silence didn't last long. After I signed the deal and left the boardroom, word of what had just happened spread like wildfire. People who had once glanced past me in the elevator now looked stunned when I walked by. The woman they once labeled just a secretary had halted a $373 million deal with a single missing signature and restarted it just as effortlessly. By the afternoon, an emergency meeting was called. This time they asked, not ordered, me to attend. I walked in calmly, every step measured. Gone was the timid posture I used to wear around my aunt. Gone was the careful silence. I didn't need to act small anymore. The long mahogany boardroom table looked different today. No one leaned back in smug confidence. Even Janice sat straight, hands folded tightly, her usually proud chin dipped ever so slightly. The room smelled of tension and perfume, hers mostly. "Mira," one board member began, clearing his throat. "I think we all owe you some overdue recognition." I raised an eyebrow. Recognition for doing what I've always done. The older man paused, embarrassed. "I think it's time," I continued, "that we clear something up." I opened the binder I'd brought, my own. Inside were files, charts, and documented proof of the operations I'd overseen during the last 2 years. Logistics restructuring, budget approvals, international negotiations, internal audits. Projects that had saved the company millions. Projects that bore my signature, often disguised under general admin codes or team efforts. I've been managing 60% of our international operational strategy without title credit, I said, because I was told my role wasn't client-facing enough to deserve visibility. Janice flinched. "And yet," I continued, "when supply chains froze last year, who coordinated the alternate vendors that kept our factories running?" Silence. Who caught the miscalculation in the Mexico deal before it cost us litigation? Still silence. I turned a page. Who signed off on the vendor contract from Singapore that quadrupled our profit margin in Q2? More silence, followed by a subtle nod from the CFO. Then I looked at Janice. "You've built your image by overshadowing others, Aunt Janice. And it worked for a while. But even shadows can't exist without a light source. I've been that light behind you for far too long." Janice opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face was pale, lips pressed tightly, hands shaking slightly at her sides. "I didn't expose this for revenge," I added. "But let's not pretend anymore." The room shifted. One by one, people who had dismissed me began asking questions, curious, not condescending. Board members leaned in. Legal staff listened carefully. I noticed a few exchanging glances, realizing that they'd never truly known the backbone of their own company. Janice tried to regain footing. "This is still a team effort, Mira. You can't act like you've done it all." "I never said I did," I replied smoothly. "But I did far more than you let anyone know. And it's time that stops." For the first time in years, Janice had nothing to say. Her voice, her greatest weapon, was silent. And I was finally seen. The days that followed felt surreal, like watching a slow collapse from behind a glass wall. I didn't gloat. I didn't storm offices or demand anything. I just kept showing up, doing what I always had, but now with eyes on me that truly saw. The board had seen enough. What started as whispers turned into formal inquiries. Meetings were called, this time without my Aunt Janice at the head of the table. The same board members who once applauded her sharp tone and iron grip now looked uneasy when her name came up. Something had shifted permanently. Power had changed hands, not with drama, but with undeniable truth. They began digging. Turns out, my aunt's reign had been littered with quiet negligence, disguised as decisive leadership. Financial oversight she'd blamed on interns? It was her. A misstep in vendor contracts that nearly cost us exclusive deals in Europe? Covered up. Her hiring practices? Heavily skewed in favor of friends, and yes, family. The HR director presented a file during a private review meeting. It listed multiple complaints of hostile management style, mostly dismissed or handled internally. I recognized some of the names. So did the board. I was asked to sit in during her executive review. Not to accuse her, but to answer questions, clarify timelines, verify decisions. Janice walked into that meeting with her signature poise. Chin up, hair in its usual severe bun, lips pressed in the shade of someone used to winning arguments. But her eyes flickered when she saw me seated comfortably at the table, right beside the chairman. I assume this is all just a formality, she said dryly, flipping her folder open. No, the chairman said. This is a reassessment. The next hour was brutal, not by yelling, not by accusations, but by facts, dates, memos, emails, numbers. Why was this contract rushed through without full board review? Why were 3 senior female staff members moved out of key roles within a month after disagreements with you? How did a personal assistant with no experience become a regional manager under your recommendation? Janice shifted in her seat. Her sharp tongue faltered under the weight of data. And then came the moment I'll never forget. Mira, the chairman turned to me. Would you be willing to temporarily oversee Janice's departments until we complete this transition? The room was silent. Janice's hands curled into fists. Excuse me. The chairman continued, calm and firm. Effective immediately, your executive decision-making authority will be suspended. Janice, pending formal board review, will determine permanent restructuring next quarter. But this has gone on long enough. Janice looked at me, really looked like she was seeing me for the first time. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, just quiet implosion. I nodded at the chairman. I'll make sure everything continues to run smoothly. As Janice stood to leave, her heels clicking against the marble floor sounded less like power and more like retreat. No one stood. No one defended her. Her downfall wasn't a flame out. It was a slow extinguishing of control she had taken for granted. And I didn't need to lift a single stone to collapse that pedestal. The truth did it for me. I used to wonder if silence was weakness, if staying in the background meant you'd always be invisible. But now, walking into the boardroom, not as the assistant they overlooked, but as the CEO they now depended on, I finally understood silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. I didn't need applause. I didn't crave their approval anymore. What I had now couldn't be taken away because it was earned. Every late night, every ignored idea, every time I'd smiled through a dismissive comment or done the work while someone else claimed the credit, it had built something inside me. Not bitterness, not revenge, clarity. And with clarity came strength. Real strength. Not the kind that shouts to be heard, but the kind that moves things quietly because it knows its worth. The first meeting I led as CEO, I noticed it. The stillness when I entered, the focus in their eyes, the careful way they listened, not because I demanded it, but because they'd seen what I could do. They'd seen the woman they once called a mediocre secretary become the very person who steadied the company when it could have crumbled. My aunt hadn't spoken to me since that day, and that was fine. I didn't need an apology from her. Some people aren't capable of seeing past their own reflection, but I'd stopped waiting for people like her to validate my place in the room. I belonged because I'd shown up, even when no one thought I mattered. Later that evening, I stood by my office window, watching the city breathe beneath me. The skyline looked different from here, not because it changed, but because I had. I thought about my younger self, working nights, struggling through school, showing up in secondhand clothes while others wore designer heels. I wish I could tell her, don't worry. They'll see one day, and when they do, you won't need to yell. You'll just walk in, and everything will speak for itself. That's what power is. Not loud, not cruel, but graceful, steady, unshakable. I turned off the light in my office and stepped out, not as the girl who was pointed at and ridiculed, but as Mirror Kingston CEO. And this time no one dared to scoff.